Hey guys, Dr. Zack Rourk here. Today on the podcast, I'm going to talk to you about what it means for training to actually be sport specific. What does it mean for an exercise program, an exercise, a workout to really be hockey specific? We're going to talk about dynamic correspondence, which is what I studied when I was going to grad school and working on my doctorate. We're going to talk about force velocity relationships, ground contact times. We're going to get into the weeds of what it means for training to really matter for hockey. And then we'll talk about why it matters. So if you use hockey specific training, you can be more efficient. You can get better results in less time. That's really why it matters. So for the details, take a listen. Okay, so today we're going to talk about sport specificity. What does it mean for your off-ice training to be specific to hockey performance? That's kind of what we're going to try to cover. And the reason we're going to cover that is because, in today's day and age, that's kind of like the buzzword is the training specific? Is it sport specific? Now, I would say that you could put training, off-ice training on a continuum. And on the one end, there's pretty traditional training. And when I think of traditional training, what I mean by that is it's your barbell training. It's your squatting, your benching, your deadlifting, your Olympic lifts, your hex bar deadlifts, that kind of stuff, where the goal implicitly is to lift heavy weight. And if you lift heavy weight, you get stronger. And if you get stronger, that makes you better at hockey, right? And then you have on the other end of the continuum is what I would consider sport specific training. And sport specific training is where you look at the details of the sport and you pull out the major characteristics, the major performance characteristics and constraints, and then you match your training to those characteristics and constraints. Okay. Now, along that continuum, I am like as far on the sport specific side as you can get. And I'll talk about why kind of as we go. But when I was working on my doctorate, what I studied primarily was the theory of dynamic correspondence. And the theory of dynamic correspondence is basically how do you study the sport? How do you pull out those characteristics and constraints so that you can create an exercise that's going to match the sport? And the idea is that if the exercise matches the sport based on those constraints and those characteristics, it will have better transfer. Okay, so we'll unpack a couple things there. So first one is transfer. The idea behind transfer is if you get 5% better at an exercise, how much better do you get at the sport, at hockey, right? And you could do an exercise and you could get 5% better at it, and you could get worse at hockey, okay? And that's something that I have seen in the past, right? So that would be negative transfer. That's an exercise you never want to do, or a program, or a part of a program, or a cycle, or whatever that you never want to do. Then you have no transfer. So you do an exercise, you improve at the exercise, but you don't improve at the sport. And then you have positive transfer. You do an exercise and you improve at the sport to some degree, or you get better at the exercise and you get better at the sport to some degree. Now, in the training space, I would say most exercises, most programs that are training hockey players are mostly positive transfer programs. The question isn't, does it work? This is the thing that drives me crazy. The question about a training program or an exercise or whatever is not, does it work? Because almost all training programs work. In fact, I teach a master's program in strength and conditioning at University of Wisconsin River Falls. And in that program, in the master's and the undergrad classes I teach, I always ask my students, raise your hand if you've been part of a training program that didn't work, right? So you started the program and you did your testing, and then you ended the program and you did your testing, and nobody got better. No one raises their hand, okay? So the argument that the training works is not a good argument because all training works, okay? So what we're trying to get to the bottom of when it comes to training and performance program design is not, is it effective? It's to what degree, right? We want the most effective program. And what we'll talk about at the end is what we're actually looking for a lot of times is efficiency, because we're going to be constrained by time quite a bit. Okay, so transfer of training is, and you could think of transfer of training as trying to maximize efficiency, because what we want to do is, with the time that we invest in off ice training, with the time that we invest in exercise, we want to get the most return in terms of performance on the ice, right? So if you spend a bunch of time training and you get really good at lifting weights in the gym, but that only makes you a little bit better on the ice, maybe we could have done it more efficiently. And a more efficient way to do it would actually be to train less, train more specifically, and then get bigger improvements on the ice. So that's how I look at training. That's always my major goal. If you like what you learned here, you're going to love training with us. If you live near Edina, Minnesota, go to perfectworldhockey.com/consultation to set up a consultation and come on in and work with us in our gym. If you don't live close to Edina, Minnesota, go to perfectworldhockey.com/remote training to download our app and get started training at your gym with our stuff today. I want to train as little as possible and maximize the results, so it's as efficient as possible. And being really specific in your training is what's going to allow you to accomplish those goals. So dynamic correspondence, that's what I studied when I was in school. And it is the basic sort of underlying foundational principle to pretty much everything that we do here at the gym. There are 5 components to it, and we're going to touch on the 2 biggest ones, the 2 primary components. And so the first one is, when you want to create an exercise for a particular sport, that exercise has to match the sport in terms of movement pattern. That's the first one. And then the second one is in terms of the force velocity relationship. And so we'll break those down. So the first one is excuse me. First one is movement pattern. And an easy way to think about movement pattern is if you ask the following 3 questions. The first is, does the exercise use the same muscles as when you're skating? The second is, does the exercise use the same joint movements as when you're skating? And then the third one is, does the exercise use the same sequence as when you're skating? And I use skating as a proxy for hockey, because it's primarily what we train, is we want you to be able to move better on the ice. But when I say skating, I'm talking about skating in hockey. And skating in hockey is characterized primarily by acceleration, deceleration in short bursts. The average duration of a high-intensity movement in hockey is 2.4 seconds in the NHL. And the average amount of active rest, which would be two-footed glide or low-intensity skating between bouts, so between those 2.4-second bouts of maximum intensity, is going to be somewhere on the order of like 10 to 16 seconds. So mostly what hockey skating is explosive short bout, 1 to 3 seconds, and then about 10 to 16 seconds of cruising around, gliding, low intensity skating, and then another explosive bout. And you repeat that for 30 to 50 seconds. And then you have passive rest after that, obviously. So that's why we use skating. But you could also, like if you were interested in improving your shot velocity or something like that, which is something that we do here too, you would want to match the movement pattern to how you actually shoot, right? But to simplify for today, we're just going to talk about skating. And the real focus in skating would be accelerating and decelerating. Okay, so the first one was, does the exercise use the same muscles as skating? And so the muscles that I key in on for skating are going to be primarily hip musculature. The powerhouse or the engine of your skating stride is supposed to be your glute max and your glute med working together. It's not supposed to be your quads, okay? And this is important because a lot of training gets really focused in on quads. And what we really need to do for hockey players is make sure that their hips are functional. So we need to, and also the glute max and glute med are typically, let's say, the weakest link on a hockey player that I see. So glute max, glute med, that's like the butt and the side of the hip. And then your adductors, your groin muscles. Your groin muscles or adductors are inside of the legs. Those are the muscles that are responsible for recovery. So that's getting your foot back under you in your skating stride. And then your glute max, glute med are responsible for like really pushing off and getting into extension in your skating stride. Now, your knee and your quad are part of that, but they're not the primary driver. At least they're not supposed to be. So there's a lot of hockey players that their quads will really gas out on them. If that's what you're feeling as the thing that fatigues first on you, probably have problems with hip muscles and skating. So what I look for is the same muscles, meaning glute max, glute med, adductor groups primarily. Those are the ones that I'm after. Does the exercise use the same joint movements as skating? So what I mean by that are like those sciencey movement terms: adduction, abduction, extension, etc. And what I focus on is at the hip. And at the hip, it's a complicated movement. The skating stride creates a complicated movement at the hip, which is abduction, which is where the hip moves to the side. And then it's rotation. And it's actually internal and external rotation, depending on the point in the stride. And then it's extension of the hip, which would be like the leg going behind you. And so I call that an ARE pattern. I actually got that from Jack Blatherwick. And it's abduction, rotation, extension, all at the same time, and to varying degrees depending on the type of stride, where you're at on the ice, what you're trying to do. So what I look for in an exercise is it using those hip muscles first, and then second, is it using those hip muscles in that ARE pattern? The last thing that I look at is the sequence, and the sequence is really important. And I think the simplest way to talk about it is it has to be a hip first sequence. So you can do a lot of lifts, especially Olympic variations, especially deadlift variations, where the sequence is reversed and they're actually knee first exercises. And some of that depends on the technique that you're using and how good your technique is. But what I've noticed is that a lot of my hockey athletes, if they're left to their own devices, will take what is supposed to be a hip first exercise and turn that into a knee first exercise. And so some of that is in exercise design and some of that is in technical execution. All of that is to say that the exercise should look like skating, right? If you like what you're learning here, you're going to love our free Hockey Hips protocol. It's the same protocol that I've developed over the last 10 years. I use it with all my pros. It's designed to maximize the performance of your hips, to maximize the performance on ice, and to reduce your injury risk on ice. If you want this free protocol, visit us at perfectworldhockey.com/remote training. Now, there are times where we're going to get into kind of unusual loading situations. We come up with some kind of off-the-wall exercises that don't really look like skating until you look at it from a muscles, movement, sequences perspective. And then you can see like, oh, we actually did line all of that up. It just doesn't look like skating because maybe we're using a weird piece of equipment or it's being loaded strangely. Okay, so that's the first big category that you need to match on, is the movement pattern. The second one, and the movement pattern I'd say is pretty straightforward. Most people can kind of eyeball that and it makes sense. There are some little nuanced things, but for the most part, we can see that. The second one is more complicated, a little more abstract, and that's the force-velocity relationship. And the thing that you got to know about force velocity in human performance is that they have a relationship where if you have high force, you cannot have high velocity. And if you have high velocity, you cannot have high force. And so if somebody is talking about a high force, high velocity exercise, it's not being described accurately, to say the least. Okay. So there's this trade-off relationship between force and velocity. Now, I talked earlier about how on the traditional side, the implicit goal is to lift heavier, lift more weight so that you get stronger. And if you get stronger, that'll make you better at hockey. And to some degree, that's true. And there's tons of research out there that'll say that there will be correlations between increases in strength and increases in on-ice performance. And that kind of goes back to my earlier statement about we're not trying to figure out what works because almost everything works. We're trying to figure out what works best, what's most efficient. And in my mind, especially based on the theory of dynamic correspondence, if your goal is to get stronger purely by lifting heavier weights, you're going to be right out of the gates, it's an inefficient program. And here's why. Because the force velocity relationship of hockey is not a high force, low velocity relationship. It's actually it's not the opposite, okay, because it's not all the way to being a high velocity sport. It's actually kind of in the middle. So, where weightlifting, lifting heavy weights, is high force, low velocity, hockey is sort of in the middle, and it's shifted closer to high velocity than it is to high force. And so here's how we know that. There are two ways that we look at a force velocity relationship, two primary ways. The first is ground contact time. So ground contact time is, in the sport, how long does your foot contact the ground, or the ice in our case, and actually apply force into it, okay? And so here's the continuum. In top end speed sprinting, that's considered like pretty much the highest velocity performance that you're going to undertake. In top end speed sprinting, so on the very high velocity side, the ground contact time is like 0.08 seconds, so less than a tenth of a second. In powerlifting, which what we would look at is how long does it take for a muscle to produce maximal force. For a well-trained athlete, it's like 0.5 to 0.7 seconds. So let's just call it a half a second, okay? So we have less than a tenth of a second on the high speed, high velocity side. And then we have like a half a second on the high force side. And hockey, the acceleration steps in hockey are right around 0.18 to 0.2, so like 0.2 of a second. So it's not exactly in the middle. It's shifted closer to high velocity, right? And then when you get into your fourth through like seventh, eighth steps in hockey, your ground contact time actually increases, and it'll move all the way up to like 0.3, okay? And that would be in hockey, that would be close to top speed for hockey. And I put that in air quotes because top speed skating in hockey and top speed skating in like speed skating are very different. Ground contact time in speed skating for top speed is going to be way closer to 0.4, 0.5. There's some differences in technology, and the biggest difference is they have a lot of space, right? In hockey, you almost never have space to get up to that top speed. So anyways, the major takeaways here are the ground contact time in hockey that we're looking to train is like 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. And it's mostly 0.2. We want to be, if we're in that 0.18 to 0.22, that's ideal, because that's like we said before, hockey is characterized by acceleration and deceleration, high intensity bouts that last right around 2.5 seconds, right? So that's going to be the first couple of strides. And that means that that's going to be ground contact times of like 0.18 to 0.2. Okay, so if I'm doing a bunch of traditional training where my implicit goal is to lift heavier weights, what I'm doing is I'm training the ability to produce force with a ground contact time that's close to 0.5, right? Now, will that make me better at performances of 0.2 seconds? To some degree, yeah, especially if I'm a low training age athlete. So I haven't really done much training in my life before. Then if I get stronger, yeah, I'll get better at skating. Okay, but the question is transfer. So how much of me getting better at lifting heavy weight will transfer to me getting better at skating at that point too? And the answer is that the transfer is less than if I got better at an exercise that took zero point 0.2 seconds. Okay. So, and you can probably see where I'm going with this. But if I determine that in my sport is more on the velocity side than on the force side, then I want to do training that's more on the velocity side. Okay. And one of the ways that I'd match it is through ground contact time. Okay. The second way that we look at the force velocity relationship in a sport is we look at what is the external resistance, right? So what do we need to overcome in the movements that we're going to normally see in hockey? And for the most part, it's body weight. You need to move your own body around the ice. Now, hockey, obviously, there's physical contact. And if you look at the numbers, it happens frequently enough that it's worth taking into account. But it's not like a good comparison to something that has high external contact due to physical contact with other players would be like offensive linemen. So an offensive lineman is going to be way on the high force side of things because they have to overcome a lot of external resistance for a high majority of the time that they perform. Whereas a hockey player, again, is going to skew closer to the high velocity side of things. Do they have to overcome external resistance? Yes. Is it constant and is it super high? No. So if you look at both of those categories, ground contact time and force velocity relationship, what both of those are telling us is that an emphasis on lifting heavy isn't really appropriate for hockey. Now, is it bad? Not necessarily, especially if you have a low training age. If you have a higher training age, you've been training for a while, playing for a while, you're competing at a pretty high level, it can actually start to hamper to hinder your performance when you get to those higher levels. But if you're pretty young, like you can get away with it, is kind of the idea. So that's the way that I look at training is, and I look through more lenses than that, but those are the two big ones I'd say. Okay, so why does sports specificity matter? Why does it even matter? And we've been kind of dancing around it, but basically it matters for efficiency. What we want to do is we want to train as little as possible and get the highest effect, right? And what's nice is that if you train really specifically, you can accomplish both of those things. And here's the metaphor or analogy that I use. If I have a Spanish test, I could go home and study Spanish, or Spanish and Italian are both Romance languages. They're similar. There's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of carryover. And if I was fluent in Italian, I bet I would do okay on that Spanish test, right? I would do better on that Spanish test than if I wasn't fluent in Italian and I didn't study Spanish. So what I could do for my Spanish test is I could go home and I could really study Italian really hard, right? And if I did, that would give me some help on the Spanish test. Or I could go home and I could study Spanish. And not only would I study Spanish, but I would study the section of Spanish that's on the test that's coming up, right? So that's sports specific training, is studying the right chapter in the right language. Where traditional training or non-specific training is saying like, hey, we're studying a language and it's kind of similar and it will help. And we've seen, like, we have proof that it helps. We have testing that it helps. Like, sure, it helps, but it's not very efficient, right? Okay, so why does it matter to be efficient? Well, one, there's only so much time in the day. And I'm sure as somebody who's a hockey fan that's listening to this podcast, you know that there's not enough time to get in everything as it is, right? But the biggest reason that you need to be efficient is because there's a real risk of overtraining at every level. And here's the golden rule, and I've talked about it in another podcast, but the golden rule is you get 8 to 10 exposures in a week and you get 2 in a day. And an exposure is a practice, it's a game, it's a workout. It's basically any time that you get together with a group for, let's say, an hour or more, and your goal is to get better at your sport. So you kind of know it when you see it. Now, if you play hockey and lacrosse, all your lacrosse exposures count too. Okay. So you get 8 to 10 and you get 2 in a day. So don't do more than 2 in a day. Don't do more than 8 to 10 in a week. And if you think about that, all of a sudden, we pretty much just put handcuffs on you. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we can get all of the adaptations you need from training. We need to get those done as in as short amount of time as possible and in as few sessions as possible. Okay? So being efficient is really important. And what being efficient does is it allows you to keep from overtraining, and it allows you to keep from doing from getting what people are worried about with repetitive use injuries. So the biggest argument that I get against sport-specific training is, well, you don't want to have repetitive use injuries. So they're skating and they're playing out there, and when they come in the gym, they need to do something different, right? So that they don't wear out, basically. And what I say to that is, if you're getting a repetitive or an overuse injury, it's because you're doing too much. That's the bottom line, is you're doing too much. And so the answer is not to do as much as you can, physically skating, and then add more training of something else on top of it. The answer is you need to skate a little bit less, and you need to train a lot less. And all of your training needs to line up with what your sport performance is. Most people that I see in the hockey performance world overtrain. And, they're keeping up with the Joneses or whatever, or they just don't know. But most people are overtraining. And a way to make it easier to overtrain is to train really generally all over the place so that you can kind of like spread out the wear and tear, right? And what I'm saying is don't just train more for the sake of training more. Instead, train less, skate less to some degree, but make sure that you do the highest quality training, the highest quality skating, the most specific training, the most specific skills, skating, conditioning, that kind of stuff, so that you're as efficient as possible. And what you'll find is, one, you don't overtrain, so you have less injuries, and performance improves because of that. And two, because you're doing the most specific, most efficient, most effective training, your performance overall will improve because of that as well. So this is, you could basically sum this up as, don't train, harder, train smarter, right? So it's not about doing more, it's about doing the right stuff. And when it comes to the overuse and repetitive use injury stuff, a lot of times the problem is just that you're doing too much. And so if you have to pull back on what you're doing, but you want to see the same rate of improvement, then you're going to have to be more efficient. That's just how the math works out. So I think that the reason sport specificity matters is because there's a limit on how much you can do. Now, most people are going over that limit and they're paying for it without knowing. And the way that you pay for it without knowing is, one, your performance improvement isn't as much as it could be, and two, you're basically creating an injury down the line, right? So to summarize quick, the way to look at a basic way to look at sport specificity is the movement pattern the same? Do you use the same muscles? Do you use the same sequence? Do you use the same movements as you would in your performance? And then is the force velocity relationship the same? Is it the same ground contact time? And is it the same external resistance? And then the application or the takeaways, one, and if you listen to one of the most recent podcasts, don't do plyometrics. Plyometrics don't have the right ground contact time. Two, don't emphasize heavy weight training, lifting heavy, heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, etc. Those two things, ground contact times and external resistances, just don't match. And then what should you do? So short sprints of like 5, 7, 10, 12, 15 yards at the most, okay? and maximal effort. And then jumping. Jump training has the same ground contact time. It has the same external resistance that you'll see on the ice. Highly transferable, and do jumps that are hockey specific, right? So that you use the same muscles, movements, and sequences that you would see in hockey. That's kind of the bread and butter here, I would say. And it transfers really well. Our athletes don't have to train as much, and our injury levels are low because of it. All right, guys, that's what I have for you today. I hope that was helpful. This has been a presentation of the PWHT podcast. If you like what you heard here, you're going to love training with us. If you live near Edina, Minnesota, schedule a consultation with us at perfectworldhockey.com/consultation. If you don't live near us and you can't train in person, you're still in luck. Go to perfectworldhockey.com/remote training to download our app. That way you can do all the same training that we do in our gym at your gym at home.